Hello, my name is Connery Clark, and welcome to my Week 4 assignment of Forms of Resistance. For this assignment, I will be answering the questions: what forms of political resistance did African Americans initiate? In what specific instances was political resistance affected by the increase in discrimination and violence against African Americans? How did Black leaders frame their resistance objectives for their white audience? To what extent did Black political resistance affect the lives of ordinary African Americans, and what forms of Black resistance exist today? It took years and years of resistance from African Americans before they saw true change. African Americans used their economic power against white individuals and companies. The Don't Buy Where You Can't Work movement during the Great Depression involved the Black community refusing to buy products from places where they were not allowed jobs. This movement spread rapidly throughout the country and was very successful, resulting in many jobs provided to African Americans. Things like the March on Washington and Montgomery bus boycott moved them closer by gaining rights and elimination of segregation and Jim Crow laws. Lasting 381 days, the Montgomery bus boycott resulted in the Supreme Court ruling segregation on public buses unconstitutional. A significant play towards civil rights and transit equity, the Montgomery bus boycott helped eliminate early barriers to transportation access. This and many other acts of resistance kept the ball rolling and built up enough momentum to finally give African Americans their basic human rights. There was nobody advocating for them, and they had to stand up for themselves. As segregation tightened and racial oppression escalated across the United States, some leaders of the African American community began to reject Booker T. Washington's approach. W.E.B. Du Bois and other Black leaders channeled their activism by founding the Niagara Movement in 1905. The Declaration of Principles of the Niagara Movement states, "We especially complain against the denial of equal opportunities to us in the economic life. In the rural districts of the South, this amounts to peonage and virtual slavery. All over the South, it tends to crush labor and small business enterprises. And everywhere, American prejudice, helped often by iniquitous laws, is making it more difficult for Negro Americans to earn a decent living." The Niagara Movement attempted to bring about legal change addressing the issues of crime, economics, religion, health, and education. The movement stood apart from other Black organizations at the time because of its powerful demand for equal rights. Later, Black leaders joined white reformers in 1909 to form the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, otherwise known as the NAACP. Early in its fight for equality, the NAACP used the federal courts to challenge disenfranchisement and residential segregation. Job opportunities were the primary focus of the National Urban League. The American Civil Rights and mass protest movement against racial discrimination in the United States began in the 1950s. This movement was deeply rooted in the multi-century effort of African Americans and their enslaved ancestors to resist racial oppression. There were many nonviolent or peaceful protests that occurred during this movement and resulted in retaliation from the white community. Despite being emancipated after the Civil War, African Americans still faced major forms of discrimination through Jim Crow laws and acts of violence. NAACP leader Harry Moore protested segregation in Florida and was killed when his home was bombed on Christmas in 1951. In Cicero, Illinois, 1966, there were still no Black residents, but many Blacks were employed in the city. When protesters marched through town, white residents threw bottles and bricks at the activists. But the marchers were not pledged to nonviolence, so they picked up bricks and bottles and threw them right back. Though this ended up not being a peaceful protest anymore, the white individuals still showed violence and discrimination first against the fact that they were protesting for their rights. The efforts made by the civil rights movement encouraged all African Americans to get involved. Peaceful protests were spreading and becoming more popular, with many individuals joining and protesting in the streets. Many joined the bus boycotts and did whatever they could to non-violently protest, even if they faced more discrimination for it. The civil rights movement was an empowering yet precarious time for Black Americans. The efforts of civil rights activists and countless protesters of all races brought about legislation to end segregation, Black voter suppression, and discriminatory employment and housing practices. The many protests and the March on Washington helped secure the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which forbade discrimination in voting, public accommodations, and employment, and permitted the Attorney General of the United States to deny federal funds to local agencies that practice such discrimination. With the increase in police brutality emerging in the 21st century, there have been many protests in the creation of the Black Lives Matter campaign. In 2013, the movement began with the use of the first hashtag Black Lives Matter on social media after the shooting and fatal death of Trayvon Martin. The killing of George Floyd created an explosion and outcry of individuals who stood up for the wrongful killing of the Black individuals due to racial bias. George Floyd was a Black man who was wrongfully killed by a police officer. The police officer in question had his knee on his throat for 8 minutes. Meanwhile, Floyd was yelling and screaming that he couldn't breathe. After those 8 minutes, he showed no signs of life and was killed. Countless African American men, women, and children are being killed by police just by simply fitting a profile. Kids who have toy guns and are playing with them. A teenager with a cell phone in his hand that looked like a gun, but it was hard to tell. A Black man unlocking the front door to his own house who looks suspicious. About 1,000 civilians are killed each year by law enforcement officers in the United States. By one estimate, Black men are 2.5 times more likely than white men to be killed by police during their lifetime. In another study, Black people who are fatally shot by police seem to be twice as likely as white people to be unarmed. Through simulations and officer training, some predictive factors in this behavior is racial bias, insecure masculinity, and bad tempers. Not only is this a major issue seen everywhere, but there are many episodes on television depicting these horrific events. One that stands out to me is a Grey's Anatomy episode where a young boy was shot in the neck by a police officer because he believed the boy was trying to break into a house. The house ended up being his own, he just forgot the key. The boy even tried going to the neighbor's house, but nobody was home, so he tried to climb through the window. Someone called the police and was shot and killed. The one Black doctor talks to the policeman after the boy dies and says that it wasn't just a judgment call. It was a reaction, because when they see color, and the reaction they have between a white kid and a brown kid in that split second is the measurable, fixable difference. Bias is fixable. These armed police officers who have this racial bias react in the wrong way, and they have a lethal weapon that they're able to use. The bias has to shift, and any officer that shoots blindly should be fired. This is a picture I found of one of the many Black Lives Matter protests after George Floyd was killed. I live in East Longmeadow, and we had a protest during the summer of 2020 out in the center of town. It was so powerful and emotional to hear our community talk and say their experiences and how they feel about the issues, and it was really amazing to see one of my favorite high school teachers, who's the only Black male teacher, give his thoughts and his experiences of discrimination throughout the years, and even still being discriminated against, being the only Black teacher in the high school. It was a really great experience, and I'm glad I was able to go to at least one and show my support for the movement. These are my references. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation.